Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish Prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.
Hello and welcome to Through a Scottish Prism. This episode we're very lucky to be speaking to a trans woman, Seven Hex.
So Seven, nice to see you. And my first question is about the process you went through to transition and how it compares with the proposals for self-ID process.
So, I mean, I went through, 10 years ago I transitioned, and it was the, that whole medical gatekeeping checks and balances process that I had. And it was a very rigorous process and people, there are complaints that it's an invasive process. The truth is it needs to be invasive. And these people need to get down to, sort of root cause of the problems that you're experiencing. And it's important to understand and remember that, there are other comorbidities that can present as dysphoria. And there's a duty of care from the medical profession to ensure that all these avenues are explored to make sure that this person is indeed a transsexual person and not experiencing dysphoria as a result of something else. For example, trauma, even isolation, social isolation, that kind of thing, and or even autism. So yeah, it was a very rigorous process, but one that I feel and believe is necessary. But when it comes to self-ID, what you got to remember is that self-ID isn't just one thing. People will claim that self-ID is just an administrative change that allows people to sort of, identify as, a member of the opposite sex, whatever. But there's no checks and balances on who's doing this. But self-ID is also supported by very dangerous narrative, particularly pertaining to children, where you have children going through this, attending gender clinics and stuff, and rather than being allowed to go through the, all that exploratory stuff to make sure that, you're ruling out all these other things, clinicians are being instructed to affirm these kids and their, and their identity. And that's a dangerous thing. When you look at desistance rates, sort of historically, anywhere up to 9 out of 10 kids presenting with dysphoria would over time naturally desist and sort of grow out of it. But recent research indicates that, with self-ID and this affirmation process, these kids are sort of pushed onto medication quite quickly, including puberty blockers and then cross-sex hormones. And the thing is that if you're affirming these kids, then, if you've got anywhere up to 9 out of 10 who would naturally desist, then that's 9 out of 10 that you've done a disservice to by simply affirming them in the process, because ultimately these are kids who would have naturally grown out of it, but now they have to face the consequences of having taken puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. And we can see this in young detransitioners and some of the things that they're telling us, And so, yeah, we need to find better ways of identifying that 1 out of 10 that would go, who wouldn't naturally desist and who would go on to transition. But that requires research. That requires people going in and actually trying to establish what is going wrong, what is going on that's driving this? Is there actually, you know, a root cause, that sort of stuff? But we're not allowed this research. They don't want it. You know, the trans activists, Stonewall, the rest of them, they don't want this research, because if they were ever to identify criteria upon which you could successfully determine and accurately determine if someone is, you know, transsexual, you know, with, you know, dysphoria, all the rest of it, and there are potentially causal things that lead to that, then that's necessarily exclusive. Anyone who doesn't meet this criteria would be necessarily excluded. So of course they don't want that, because they're pushing self-ID, where you have to just accept that when people say they are a thing, they are that thing. You know, any man who says he's a woman, you know, you have to accept that. And that's with or without self-ID, that individual, even in, because self-ID isn't even law yet, but it's de facto law. So it's, we can see it in, you know, the equality steps in various institutions, companies, all the rest of it. They reference gender, not sex. And yeah, the policy capture on this has been extraordinary. And as I said, because it's not even law yet, but then to challenge or question, you know, or to suggest that somebody might need help, other kinds of help, is seen as hateful. The suggestion that therapists should allow people presenting with dysphoria to sort of talk it out and, you know, find that space where they can explore the issues that are affecting their life, that's considered conversion therapy.
Yeah.
You know, but what somewhat ironically is that when you consider the kids who would normally desist, generally speaking, are often turn out to be gay.
Yes.
Then why isn't it considered conversion therapy to force these kids who would otherwise just be gay into transition? And it's not conversion therapy. When you had Buck Angel on,
yes,
Buck had mentioned about how he felt that therapy, you know, going to see the therapist, that time with the therapist that you were taking, that was his safe space. And I have to agree with that. When he said that, I was like, yeah, absolutely, because that's the place where you're not judged. You can just talk. Yes, your therapist will ask you questions and get some sort of handle on how your life is going. But that was a safe space. There's nobody telling you what you must be, how you must feel, what you must think. You know, and that's the way it should be. We should be exploring all these options for people to make sure that they're making the right decision. Self-ID is a travesty. It's doing a massive disservice to transsexual people like me, because the idea that, you know, I've been through an extensive process, as did the transsexuals of my generation before, and, you know, to turn around and say that can just be substituted with little more than a Scout's honour and a signature and a rubber stamp, you know, that it undermines everything that we went through. And the thing is, of course, is that when you do that, when you do say that it is just not, you know, Scout's honour, I promise to live my life as a woman for the rest of my life, you know, sign here, rubber stamp, boom, you're a woman, congratulations. But of course, that person, with that available to them, they are never seeing a therapist because they can just go ahead and do that. So they're never seeing a therapist, and that again is a disservice, because that individual, whoever they are, may have various traumas that they need to have explored, they need to discuss, that are now manifesting in dysphoria. And, you know, instead of, you know, putting them through a process where these issues could be talked about, discussed, you know, identified, and then that person put on an appropriate, you know, path to a healthy recovery, they're just left on their own. They don't need to go and see anybody. They don't need to do anything. They don't need to have that conversation. They can just rock up, sign a bit of paper, get a rubber stamp job, and on they go. And
it's a cheap way, you know, in a way for the government to deal with people. The trans umbrella is very wide, and it's difficult to talk about because you have the small number of transsexuals that were always the transsexual, but now it's joined by a number of different people, different groups, all under the one umbrella. So when we talk about a lot of females, young females, transitioning because they're homosexual, really, as you pointed out, and male, but also you also have the males that, like Eddie Izzard, that just say they got a girl's brain, you know, and they're under the same umbrella. There's no similarity between these two cases.
It then becomes like, who is trans?
Yeah.
You know, because they talk, I mean, you hear the TREs talking about, you know, trans being a minority. Right, well, who qualifies? Like, if you're a minority group, then there must be constraints on who can qualify to be in that minority group.
They're an inclusive minority, so everyone can be in.
Exactly. Because all of a sudden, the trans identity has just been carved open to anybody, to all and sundry, to anybody who wants it. All you need to do is say the magic words, and all of a sudden, you're like me. You're a trans person. And that's insane. Because there are no constraints on, you know, under self-ID, there are no constraints on who's trans. So literally, the whole world could identify as trans. You know, people who are otherwise just ordinary people, who are seeking to be in some small way extraordinary, are latching on to identities that aren't theirs.
The doctors to just give drugs to people is much cheaper than therapy.
I feel sorry for the doctors because so my therapist, when I went through transition, I subsequently discovered that my therapist has left. Like, he went, and actually that doesn't surprise me. Remembering the kind of guy he was, the interactions that we had, so he was very adamant and about that gatekeeping, checks and balances process. He was, that's what he was about. One of the first things he told me was that the clinic had not long been successfully sued because it had been the wrong choice for someone. And so essentially they were being extra vigilant. When self-ID and all this came along, I wondered how he would have taken it or what he would have thought about it. And then to subsequently, like I said, learn that he left doesn't surprise me. He would not have been on board with this at all. Not at all. And but this is because the lobbying that has surrounded self-ID has been so successful. When you look at anybody who questions self-ID and its surrounding narratives risks running afoul of Stonewall, TREs, and the LGBT orgs. And we've seen this with people, predominantly women, losing their jobs, having their reputations smeared. And even as far as the likes of Joan McAlpine requiring police escorts and stuff. I mean, that's how bad it is. So when you consider the doctors involved, I mean, they must in some ways, I suppose, feel a bit powerless to speak out and object or raise any objections and ask questions. They must feel is compelled to sort of spit the dogs out.
I've never really understood why, you know, people were going along with it, because a lot of people, like, they're professional people. And, you know, for example, if you're saying, you know, male, there was an article in a newspaper a while ago about male sex offenders, and they would be housed on female wards in hospitals. And, you know, you would have thought that somebody at the hospital would have said, no, let's not do this. But everybody seems to go with along with everything, no matter how outrageous it is. And it's very sad, because men who are not trans at all, but they'll identify as females, like sex offenders, to get access to females. And so why doesn't people realise this is going to happen?
People did realise this is going to happen, but the LGBT artists like Stonewall rubbished people's concerns. They said that's not a thing, doesn't happen. You know, all these things that never happen, that always seem to happen. I mean, you look at, you know, over in America, and I dare say it's going to happen here, or it may already have happened here.
Yeah.
But we talk about male prisoners being put into the female estate.
And they're getting, and the females are getting pregnant.
Right. Right. And people obviously, like, there were these concerns were raised. This should not come as a surprise, because there are women and women's groups out there who are raising these concerns about, you know, this happening, this very thing happening. I mean, you look at the numbers of men who are now self-identifying so that they can be transferred into the female estate. It's going through the roof. And this is what happens when you have a system that removes all checks and balances. Stonewall LGBT orgs did a successful lobbying campaign. They convinced people that these fears were unfounded, that they weren't real, that this was just somehow hysterical women making things up. And then when you point out the instances where it does happen, you know, they're considered isolated, unrelated, and not to be considered. Or, you know, the very fact that you've highlighted this is I mean,
it's transphobia.
It's transphobia. I mean, I've been accused of using anti-Semitic and Nazi techniques by providing examples of where this is happening. You know, that whole thing where you can provide examples of anybody from a minority group doing something bad to cast that entire group in a negative light. And it's like, and that goes back to my original, like what I was saying earlier, right? Well, who is trans?
Yes, exactly. So you don't have
that can be considered to be part of this minority group that you're talking about, because these examples that you provide, like some of them are clearly men taking the piss, right? They're clearly men exploiting a trans identity through self-ID to get access to vulnerable women or children. I mean, you point that out, that it's self-ID in this instance, it's being exploited. You know, you're still transphobic, and it's like, well, is this person an actual trans person? This is the point I'm making. They're exploiting it because they can, because you've enabled them to do that. And when you enable them to do that, it becomes impossible for the rest of the population to separate these people out from people who went through that gate checks and balances transition process.
Do you find it makes life harder for you as a trans woman when all this controversy is going on around you?
Yeah, very much so. And it goes back to what I was saying. It becomes difficult for Joe Public. You know, with like the successful lobbying that's happened, is that in the public conscience, transvestites, cross-dressers, transsexuals, drag acts, and gender non-conforming people all fall under this transgender umbrella. So therefore, we're all the same, and we're not. We're not all. These are, you know, these are distinct groups of people This was always understood before this whole transgender thing came along. We had those words. We had transvestites, cross-dressers, transsexuals. These are where these words came from.
Because your needs, say medical needs, for example, are different from a cross-dresser's needs.
This whole thing, GRA reform, has been contentious. You know, it has led to some pretty serious conflict where, you know, for many people there wasn't conflict before.
Exactly.
You know, and being transsexual, I can't escape this conflict. I am necessarily part of it by virtue of who and what I am. I can't sort of get away from it. And it is difficult because it has led to, you know, some really strong feelings, a lot of anger, understandably so. And it makes it difficult just to navigate the world as, you know, an ordinary person.
Yeah, the debate must be quite hurtful for you at times, because prior to this, mostly everyone just rubbed along together. You know?
Right, we did. We got on. Everything was fine. Everything was going well right up until GRA reform. Self-ID is not needed.
Why do you think this is happening? Who's behind this? Because it's not us. It didn't come from the grassroots.
Definitely you've got the big pharma money spinner. You know, and it's not the first time. Like, people, I've seen it, you know, people saying, oh, you know, do you honestly think big pharma would encourage this just to make more money? It's like, yeah. So definitely big pharma, but the likes of your Stonewall and, you know, that American one that's got the equal sign for their logo, and the LGBT orgs, it's powerful, I don't know, lobby groups that are working on behalf of transvestites and cross-dressers. I mean, take here in Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP is saturated with this queer theory nonsense. There's no problem.
Yeah, the problem with the solving.
The only people who had a problem were the people for whom the process would catch them out.
Do you feel like Stonewall and the other organisations speak for you at all?
No. No. They don't. They're not interested in protecting transsexuals, protecting the trans identity. They want everything's transgender now, which means very little to me. No, it's made it worse. It's made my life far more difficult.
How do you feel about, you know, the trans allies then? So they're saying that they're on your side.
No, if you're on the side that suggests that any man can just decide that he's a woman, and that you know, to be trans you just need to identify as such, they're not on my side. They're not on my side. Because basically they're telling me that anybody is me, or anybody can be me. That everything I went through is pretty meaningless, doesn't count for anything, because that guy over there can just say the magic words, I identify as a woman, and boom, he's just as trans as you.
The new SNP Green Coalition, who believe that they are talking for you and doing things in your interests, but clearly not.
yeah. I mean, I would just say, like they're not doing anything in my interest. They're doing young people a disservice. Self-ID needs to be binned as soon as possible. The sooner that we get a resounding no to self-ID, then the sooner that we can begin to have those conversations about the things that we are going to do.
It seems that the LGBT community is dominated by a certain type of male, the very aggressive male that speaks for everyone.
And it's interesting to see the number, like whenever like one of like a TRA or somebody who's on that side, one thing that's really not, and then it's just they'll pile out and say, no.
And they have to write long apologetic letters and apologies and cry, but they'll never get back in because, you know, once you've outed yourself as a bigot and transphobe, there's no way back. So you can apologise.
You have to, you know, beg forgiveness at the altar.
The lobby groups have so much power, you know, that why do the brands that, you know, like apologise and grovel, like why don't they apologise and grovel to women? You know, without an apology.
I don't know, right?
We really need to get organised. We should start boycotting and things, you know. Anybody that's apologised for just like saying period or breastfeeding.
I mean, why are these terms now so problematic? So there is no concept of compromise. There's no, and it's our way or no way. And if you say anything against that, then you will be met with, when you consider the mantra, trans women are women, trans men are men.
Like,
right?
Yeah.
So they're not. And to accept that is to accept an article of faith. Because they're not. Only males can be trans women. So and women are adult human females. So a trans woman cannot be a woman. And to believe otherwise, like I said, is to believe an article of faith, which is, I don't know, cultish, religion-esque. I've never seen another one recently, and it was a TRA, and then it's like sex is not equal to gender, and you're like, yeah, that's what we've been saying the whole time. But then, you know, the very next tweet is like, but this trans woman is female, and you're like, no, they're not. So if you how can the one hand you can say sex is not equal to gender, but then say that a trans woman is a female? It's like, the duplicity is crazy. They don't even see it. They don't even see how they contradict themselves constantly. Self-ID, no. And the sooner that we can get a resounding no from our political leadership, and even if that has to that's driven by, you know, the average person, even if that's just contacting MSPs and stuff, the sooner that we can get that resounding no, then the sooner then we can begin to put together a plan that will resolve the issues that have arisen out of this GRA reform mess, and, you know, get the conversations going about what we are going to do pertaining to the likes of spaces, sports, and all the rest of that stuff. But like I said, we can't start that until we draw a line under self-ID and put it to rest.
Thank you very much for joining us, Seven, and I sincerely hope the Scottish Government listened to you. So I hope you all enjoyed that interview and found it informative, and I'll see you next time on Through a Scottish Prism.
Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.